Kansas City, Missouri, 19th century. The 19th century was one of monumental change for the United States, but few areas saw more growth than the region that would go on to develop into Kansas City. Sitting atop bluffs and built into ancient mounds and hillsides, the population of the city grew from a modest 1,500 in 1850 to over 163,000 only 50 years later. Roaring trains and wagons brought settlers from the East Coast to build homes and offices and industry. Cattle and other animals were gathered in the stockyards and viewed by hungry businessmen and visiting farmers. Factories sprang up to take advantage of the convenient river and train routes to move their goods. By the 1890s, Kansas City was host to thousands of hardworking settlers, the first generations of native-born Missourians, and thousands of former enslaved people and their children, among the first to be born after the Civil War. The Missouri River played a major role in the region's growth, not only providing a highly valuable route, making Kansas City the crossroads of North American trade, but also abundant hunting, fishing, and recreation. On October 10, 1897, a man walked along the riverbank just across from the city. In his arms, he carried his own 3-year-old daughter. When he arrived back home late that night, he was alone. His crime was supposedly only known to the Missouri River and himself, until a week later when the water would reveal his victim to a group of horrified hunters. October 17, 1897. For several days, people in the area just east of the Kansas City line had noticed an object in a sandbank near where the Blue River meets the Missouri River. However, it wasn't unusual to see litter dumped in the river, and it didn't strike any of the hundreds of people who walked by it on their way to and from home and work as suspicious at all. Even Brownie Owens didn't pay much attention to the object while he was searching for a good hunting spot with his friends Thomas Gillespie and James Phillips. The 3 men worked together at the Kansas City Bolt and Nut Company factory in Sheffield, but that early morning, they'd set out hoping for ducks. Owens told reporters that he saw a rope near the object whipping in the current, and it was then he knew he would have to check what the object was. He hoped that it was just a stack or some other mundane trash. He waded into the frigid autumn water to investigate, only to find the face of a young child staring back up at him from the water. Mr. Owens screamed and scrambled for the bank. All 3 men ran straight back to Sheffield and notified the coroner of what they had found. Deputy Coroner Dr. W.S. Wheeler performed an autopsy on the evening of October 17, 1897. He found that the victim was a girl between 2.5 and 3 years old. She was fully clothed, but her clothes were mostly rough and handmade, and they did not have labels. She had a wound on the right side of her head, but no skull fracture. She had a partially healed wound on her knee, and that was wrapped with a strip of fabric for a bandage. Dr. Wheeler also found another strip of fabric tightly wound around the girl's neck. After determining there was very little water in the girl's lungs and stomach, Dr. Wheeler concluded that she must have died prior to being thrown into the river. Because of the advanced state of decomposition of the body, he could not tell for sure what the cause of death was, but he speculated that either the head wound or strangulation were plausible causes of death. After the autopsy, the anonymous victim was buried by the county at Potter's Field in Union Cemetery. Police in Kansas City, led by Inspector of Detectives John Halpin, canvassed the area around Sheffield, and visited with rural people that lived along the river, but no one admitted to knowing anything about the girl. The next day, when the tragic story was reported on in the papers, tips and information began to pour in to investigators, but still no solid identification. At least, not until Eunice Levine told officers she believed the body was her daughter, Cecile Levine. Within hours, the little body was exhumed from its pauper's grave and taken back to the morgue. While Eunice Levine was positive that she was looking at the remains of her daughter, the rest of her family wasn't so sure. Nonetheless, Coroner Bedford issued a warrant for the arrest of Mrs. Levine's estranged husband, Jim Levine, on suspicion of having murdered his daughter. Except, Jim Levine didn't do it. Not only did he not do it, he proved to everyone that Cecile was alive and well, living at his brother's home. As investigators returned to the drawing board and the press returned to selling papers, one woman was about to break the case wide open. 12 miles north of where the nameless child was found, Mrs. Ella Clare visited the local police station in Liberty, Missouri. She said she knew of a missing child who matched the description of the victim, Belle Carr. Belle was born in March 1894 to William and Cyrilda Jenny Carr in Hiawatha, Kansas. She was their second child, with Belle being 3 years younger than her sister May. Unfortunately, Belle only had a short time with her family together, and it was not a very happy time. Jenny's sister, Laura Robertson, shared a home with the Carrs, and she reported that Carr was violently abusive of Jenny, especially when he had been drinking. Jenny tragically died in April 1895, supposedly after suffering from seizures. Belle and May were left in the care of Jenny's family, while William worked as a laborer for the Pacific Railway. However, he was injured and he spent several months in a Kansas City hospital recovering. When he was finally able to get up and around again on crutches, he began to take the train to Liberty to visit his foster mother, and it was there that he was introduced to Susan Elizabeth Betty Rost. He was smitten. She was a widow also, and she had a son from her previous marriage. The two were wed by February 1896. William took Belle and May to Liberty to live with him, though no reason has ever been given for this except for spite. Betty was a cruel stepmother to both girls, but she was particularly malicious towards Belle. She wasn't shy about it either. Over the summer of 1897, after receiving complaints from multiple neighbors, the city council tasked Marshall Thomason with visiting the Carr household and putting a stop to the abuse. William Carr denied the abuse, of course, but Marshall Thomason warned him that the city council would get involved if it didn't cease. It was Marshall Thomason who again approached Carr on October 25th, this time to arrest him on suspicion of murdering his daughter. William and Betty were both arrested, and Betty provided positive identification of the clothing as Belle's. Laura Robertson and other family as well as neighbors also identified the clothing. Nobody who knew her had any doubt that the clothing belonged to Belle. Carr was transported from Liberty to Kansas City for his own protection. Rumors that a mob was preparing to grab him were too loud to ignore. At the Kansas City police station, Carr was sweated for 36 hours by several investigators, including the police chief, Detective Halpin, prosecuting attorneys, and others. The whole time, he maintained that he set off with Belle from Liberty on October 10th and gave her to a traveling family that wanted her. He said that his wife didn't like Belle, so he had to get her out of the home. Nobody believed his story even for a moment. On the evening of October 26, Carr finally broke down and he confessed to murdering his own daughter. William Carr's confession disturbed everyone who heard it, not only because of the content, but because he laid out the heartbreaking details as uncaringly as if he was passing along a family recipe. The most important point, to him at least, seemed to be that his wife had nothing to do with it. The only motive he offered was that Belle didn't get along with his wife's son, and so his wife wanted her sent to a different home. According to William Carr's confession, at midday on October 10th, he began walking to Kansas City with Belle. When he set out, his mind was not set on murder. He said that thought didn't come to him until he found a length of rope in the road. Carr carried Belle in his arms and said that she slept most of the way. As he approached the Missouri River, nearly to Kansas City, he crossed the railroad tracks at Mineville, veered off the road, and began walking along the riverbank in search of a place to throw her in. The original spot that he had in mind was low and sluggish due to a regional drought, so he moved to another spot which he said was within 150 feet of a group of campers. He says he set Belle down on the ground and began searching around for a rock. Once he found one that he thought would suit the job, he used the rope to tie it around Belle's chest and arms, and then he threw her in the river. When investigators asked if Belle said anything or protested, Carr said, "She murmured something, but I didn't listen to what it was. I thought her suffering would soon be over." He watched for a short while to make sure that her body didn't rise to the surface, and then he returned to Liberty via the nearest train station where he told his wife he'd given Belle over to a family traveling to Oklahoma. The exact quotes of the confession were reported on a little differently in the local newspapers from paper to paper, but every single reporter who was present at the station when Carr confessed wrote that after he finished telling investigators how he killed his daughter, William Carr laughed. The Liberty Tribune reported, "The Kansas City officers say that no man like Carr has come within their experience, and that they have heard no sound so blood-curdling as Carr's laugh when he lay back on his couch after he ended his story. He laughed again and again, little chuckling sounds of relief, as some animal might make when it is being satisfied." After word of his disturbing confession spread, William Carr became a local celebrity in the worst way. The farmers in Clay County wanted to get their hands on him. Carr was moved temporarily to the Jackson County Jail because Detective Halpin didn't think he was even safe in the police headquarters the first night after the confession. The morbidly curious lined up in droves to lay eyes on the Missouri monster, to see what kind of man could murder his own little daughter and then laugh about it. Carr especially loved the attention he was getting from the ladies of Kansas City. Carr was approached by multiple people wanting to make a phonograph recording of his confession. Carr initially told them that it would cost $100 and then $500, but the police commissioner, who also happened to be friends with one of the phonograph owners, talked Carr down to $10 and a box of cigars. Laura Robertson and others from Carr's first wife's family also visited him at jail. They, like many others in the area, believed that Carr was covering for his wife. No matter how they pleaded, Carr did not change his story, and he remained adamant that Betty was completely innocent of any wrongdoing. Carr blamed the neighbors, who he said made up stories about them abusing Belle. He blamed reporters for reporting statements that he says he didn't make. He even blamed Belle for being so much trouble after her death. One thing he never did was show remorse or any hint of guilt. His popularity in Kansas City only inflamed sentiments against William and Betty Carr in Liberty. It was fully expected by many that Carr would be lynched as soon as he reached Clay County when he was taken to Liberty for his preliminary hearing. On the morning of October 29th, Carr ate his breakfast and remarked, "I guess this is the last meal I'll ever eat." Officers escorted him the short distance from the police headquarters to the streetcar, but by the time Carr was loaded into the trolley, a crowd was waving and shouting their goodbyes. A few minutes later, Carr was on the train and on his way to what he fully expected would be his death. The train ride to Liberty was a success. A large group of Liberty men got onto the train at Randolph and gave the officers a bit of a scare, but they assured everyone, "We're not ready to lynch him, yet." Clay County Sheriff Heimer and Deputy Sheriff Cave managed to get Carr from the Liberty train depot to the courthouse in one piece, despite the large crowd gathered in town. When Carr entered the courtroom, he saw Betty for the first time since the morning he was arrested. He asked if he could speak with her, but he was denied. Before the hearing got underway, Carr was allowed time to try to find an attorney to represent him, but he was either unable to find one who would take his case, or he changed his mind and decided against hiring one. Both were reported in the local papers. However, he returned to the courtroom and entered a plea of guilty. The judge also asked Betty for her plea. She did have an attorney representing her and entered a plea of not guilty. After some argument, her bond was set at $5,000 and she was allowed to remain free until her trial in February. Carr's trial was scheduled for November 13th. After the preliminary hearing, William and Betty Carr were allowed to meet, with an audience including the deputy sheriff, the prosecutor, Betty's family and attorneys, and reporters from the local papers. It was reportedly a disappointing meeting to the audience. The couple barely gave each other a peck. One peculiar tale did come out of the meeting, however. When Betty asked her husband why he didn't just bring Belle back home, he told her, "I didn't realize what I was doing. It was 2 days before I realized it. Then I knowed I would be catched, but I didn't have the heart to pick up and leave. I would just like to know whatever possessed me to do it." Carr's new home in Liberty was considerably less glamorous than his accommodations had been in Kansas City. He shared a cell with 8 other men, either waiting for their own trials or waiting to be transported to another location. Even so, the other prisoners were reportedly afraid of him and did whatever he told them to do. On the first full day in Liberty, his wife brought him lunch, and afterwards, Carr became violently ill to the point where the deputy called in a doctor to treat him. Though officials assured everyone that Carr had just experienced indigestion, many suspected Carr was trying to escape the noose via poisoning, with his wife's help. After this, Carr was not allowed to have visitors except for the occasional supervised visit with his wife in the sheriff's office. Because the evidence against Carr was all circumstantial aside from his own confession, Judge Broaddus would not allow Carr to plead guilty without meeting with an attorney. He assigned 2 prominent local attorneys to represent him. Despite meeting with them multiple times, Carr refused to change his plea. Judge Broaddus believed that Carr had waived his right to a jury trial entirely by pleading guilty, but he wasn't comfortable sentencing Carr to a death without having some kind of official proceeding. On November 13, 1897, just over a month after Belle was murdered, the trial of William Carr got underway. Both of Carr's attorneys gave a statement that they had met with Carr and they believed that his confession had not been made under duress, and they reiterated that it was their client's wish to enter a plea of guilty and be sentenced to hanging as soon as possible. Judge Broaddus took their statements into account and told the prosecutor that he still had to produce evidence of the corpus delicti. Basically, the prosecutor only had to prove that the body pulled from the river was, in fact, Belle, and that her death had not been natural. Dr. Wheeler, who had performed Belle's autopsy, testified that she had been murdered. He believed that she had been killed by a blow to the head or by strangulation, but admitted the body was decomposed to the point where it was impossible to tell for sure. Neighbors testified about the abuse that they witnessed. Carr's foster mother, Mrs. Mary Stevens, testified that she recognized the clothing found on the body as Belle's and that she had washed it herself many times. Belle's aunt, Laura Robertson, heartbreakingly testified that she recognized the cloak because she had made it herself for Belle. Betty was not present at the trial. Judge Broaddus announced that he was taking everything into consideration and would hold a sentencing hearing in a few days. Carr was returned to his cell where a reporter asked him how he felt now that the trial was over. Carr responded, "Oh, I feel all right, but what could a man do? What could one man do against 40? What was the point of having all those witnesses piling up costs for the state?" Despite his supposed indifference, he reached out to a probate judge later that day and quashed an attempt by Laura Robertson and her family to adopt Belle's surviving sister, May. Rather than let his former in-laws have her, Carr turned May over to an orphanage. This was seen by the community as further implicating Betty as a bad mother. Three days later, on November 16th, Carr was escorted back into the courtroom in front of Judge Broaddus for his sentencing hearing. Again, Betty was not present. In Missouri at that time, the only punishment for capital murder was death. Judge Broaddus announced that Carr would face the noose on December 17th, the soonest possible date. Carr was back in his cell barely a few minutes after having left it. When Betty heard that the hearing was over, she tried to go visit Carr, but officers told her they were too busy to allow her through. When they finally did get to see each other for the first time after the sentencing, it was a couple days later, Betty held him and proclaimed, "There is no longer any pleasure in life for me." She still had a son waiting for her at home. After his sentencing, the affable, unflappable character that had entertained Kansas Cityans fell away entirely, leaving Carr a sour, sullen man who refused to speak with reporters and only wanted for his wife. On November 28th, Carr made another attempt on his life by consuming shards of glass. One of his cellmates reported Carr had forced him to hand over a vial of medication, but the other prisoners were so afraid of Carr that they didn't report the action until after he had left the room to go meet with his wife. Carr flew into a frenzy when he was kept from her, and he had to be restrained by officers and other prisoners before a doctor could arrive and he could be medically incapacitated. During the struggle, it said that he begged Deputy Cape to shoot him because he did not want to be hanged. Religious leaders from churches across Liberty paid Carr visits, praying with him and reading the Bible. They announced that Carr had converted and would join one of the local church congregations. Despite his supposed spiritual awakening, one of the preachers who spent the most time with Carr leading up to his death later said that Carr never uttered a word of remorse or guilt to anyone about having murdered his own baby. 10 days prior to the hanging, Carr was moved into a cell by himself for his official death watch. Coincidentally or not, the gallows where he would meet his end were being built on the north side of the courthouse, just below Carr's new window. Betty visited her husband daily during his death watch, and observers were bemused by their ability to laugh and converse as if they weren't mere feet away from the stockade waiting for him. Carr asked after Betty's son and his health, joked about the Carpenters, and generally seemed content so long as his wife was by his side. When she was gone, he was mostly silent, even though his new church friends were almost always nearby. On December 14th, a few days before the hanging, it was reported to the sheriff that Betty had been asking a local physician about poisons. When she tried to visit Carr that day with lunch for him, she was turned away. She left without incident, but when Carr found out, he had a panic attack, and again he had to be sedated by the police physician. Betty was eventually allowed to see her husband again, but the sheriff evidently had his wife and daughter strip search her in his house before he would allow her to go into the cell. On December 16th, loved ones were allowed to make their final visits with Carr. Betty stayed all day. Others, including Carr's foster mother and cousin, visited him and left within minutes because he was basically ignoring them. Despite everything he'd done, Laura Robertson wrote to ask him if he wanted to see her before his death, but he declined. When the sheriff made Betty leave at about 10:30 that night, she and Carr shared an affecting goodbye, and the Liberty Tribune reported, Carr seemed to almost suffer death as he gazed through his tears after her. It would be the last time he would see his wife in this life. On paper, the execution of William Carr sounds like it was a straightforward and efficient affair, but it was a little more complicated than that. The sheriff, the person legally tasked with facilitating the sentence, had never administered a hanging. He had to borrow the hood and straps from neighboring counties because Clay County didn't even have any. William Carr was only the third person legally hanged in Missouri history, and the first white person. Sheriff Heimer hired carpenters to build a gallows and also fencing to keep the hanging from being visible to the general public. He allowed about 150 tickets to the hanging to be handed out, announcing that it would start at about 11 a.m. on December 17th. However, at 10 a.m. that morning, Carr was escorted by the sheriff from his cell where he'd spent his 10-day death watch and out to the square. The sheriff read off the death warrant and gave Carr a chance to have last rites with a priest or last words, but Carr declined. He stated simply as he walked across the stage and stood on top of the trap, "Don't lose any time, go straight ahead." Despite the fact that most of the ticket holders hadn't entered the fencing yet, the sheriff decided not to wait. As soon as the crowd outside heard the trap fall, they surged on the fencing, tearing at boards and scrambling to get in. In the chaos, a jury of men gathered around Carr under the gallows as he died. They declared that his neck snapped instantly, but his body swayed on the rope as the crowd pressed in for a long 18 minutes. In the chaos, Carr's wedding ring was snatched off his hand, and after the body was removed, the crowd turned the rope and hood into souvenirs. Carr's body was taken into the courthouse, ostensibly for a post-mortem examination, but in reality the sheriff was giving the curious crowd several hours of gawking at Carr's body before it was finally turned over to his wife. Betty had not been present at the hanging. She received her husband's body at their home, and he was buried a few days later in her family cemetery, where her first husband also rested. Unbeknownst to anyone else at the hanging, an entrepreneurial photographer named Frank Guth managed to build an enclosure for his camera so that he could secretly film the hanging. The reel was the first legal execution ever to be captured on film. Mr. Guth planned to show the execution in a theater as part of a macabre collection of true crime-related memorabilia and media. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Guth's plan to show the film was met with horror and backlash. The press in Kansas City were united in their outrage over such a movie being shown in their city. Of course, the local papers also published the ad for the presentation. It's likely that the people who were in attendance at the execution were concerned about being identified, not only because of the ghastly association, but also because the crowd had surged on the gallows and pillaged it for views and souvenirs. The people of Liberty were already being portrayed as a mob of demons and fiends. Supposedly, the 18 minutes of film was lost while in transit back to Kansas City from New York City, and it was never publicly shown. Mr. Guth told the Kansas City Star that he and others did try a piece of the strip in a gallery at Liberty, and the picture was perfect. Even after William Carr was dead and buried, the case against Betty Carr continued forward. After several delays, her trial was finally called on June 13, 1898. The prosecution called nearly all the same witnesses that he had during the trial of her husband. Betty's attorney called over 30 witnesses, almost all of them her family, who testified that she was a caring and loving mother to all of her children and had never treated Belle badly. Finally, Betty Carr testified in her own defense. She testified that Belle had always been her favorite child and that she was a good mother to her, but Belle was prone to bee stings and boils. The case was turned over to a jury who deliberated for 18 hours. However, in a move that shows stunning lack of understanding of jury bias, the sheriff used Betty's jury to smuggle out a different prisoner who was hiding from a lynch mob. Perhaps unsurprisingly, that jury was hesitant to return a verdict, and they reported to Judge Broadus that they were split 6-6. The case was dismissed, and Betty was a free woman. Belle was buried beside her mother in Hiawatha, Kansas. Her death led the people of the region to discuss how tragically preventable it was, and how many women and children were the victim of known abusers. Marshall Thomason, the officer who talked to William Carr the summer before Belle was killed, took his failure to protect her to heart. Betty stayed in the Liberty area for the majority of her life. She did not remarry. Her son, Benjamin Allen Brost, died at home with her in 1920 after a lifetime of sickness. He also never married. Betty died at home in 1931 in Clay County, Missouri, at the age of 64 of natural causes. She never escaped the suspicions that she had a hand in killing Belle Carr. Every time the case was brought up by the local media, the shadow of suspicion fell on her anew. After William Carr interfered in the adoption of May by the Robertson family, she was signed over to the Children's Home Society of Missouri, the local orphanage. Her story generated an outpouring of sympathy, and she was hosted by several prominent families in the region while her father was in custody. Reverend Powell waited until after her father's execution to send May to her new family. She was adopted by a family in the St. Louis area and changed her name. Reverend Powell told the Liberty Tribune that he received a letter from May's adoptive mother stating, quote, "I will say that we would not take a small fortune in exchange for our little girl. I hardly know how we could keep house now without her. She is as sweet a child as I have ever saw, obedient, loving, and lovable. She never speaks of the most unpleasant parts of her life to strangers." May married and had one son. She passed away in 1950 at the age of 53. She was living at Camp Campbell while her son was deployed. Her son, a World War II veteran, died in 1989. Out of everyone involved in this case, May is the only person to go on to have children. To this day, she still has surviving grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Laura Robertson left the Kansas City area behind for good within a few years of Belle's murder. She married a man from Iowa named Leon Cole, and she lived with him in his Baylor shop in Los Angeles until his death in 1935. After her husband's death, Laura lived with a young family in the Los Angeles area until her death in 1942 at the age of 67. The Belle Carr murder case left the public with questions about how it was allowed to happen, whether justice was served, and whether the execution had been more hurtful than helpful. Moral questions about whether Carr was treated fairly by the courts also circulated in papers. While Belle was called unloved and pitiful by the press, she was very much loved. She was loved by her mother's family, who fought for months to claw Belle and May back from harm's way. She was loved by her neighbors, who insisted that police investigate her abuse and ultimately her murder. Every person who viewed the clothing, who cursed at Carr, who looked at the river and shivered, thinking of her final moments, all carried a small bit of love for her. Dedicated to Belle Carr and to all the children who were let down by the ones who were supposed to protect them.